All right, so this one would be an exceeding question. I said some of these are exceeding, some of these are not. This one will be exceeding. And to do this one, it might be a little bit harder. Like for these word problems, some of the questions will say you have to show the equation. That's like kind of all it's asking. So some of them will say, rewrite this as an equation. When one says solve, for now, you're able to just solve it in any way that you see fit. But this one, because it will be exceeding, if it's on there, you will be asked to both create an equation and solve. All right, so it says the sum of three consecutive odd integers is 147. So first off, you need to know what does it mean to be consecutive and integers. All right, so for this, consecutive are right after each other. So like letters in the alphabet, A, B, C, they're consecutive letters because they follow each other in the alphabet. There's nothing in between that's missing. 1, 2, 3. They're three consecutive numbers because, once again, they follow each other. There's nothing in between. 2, 4, 6 would be three consecutive even numbers because there's no even number missing. So consecutive odd integers, we can say 1, 3, and 5. They are consecutive odd integers. So I'm just using those just so you understand what it means to be consecutive. Now what we need to do is we need to rewrite this as an equation. Once again, this would be exceeding. This is something you'll have to be able to do next year, but not necessarily right now. So the sum, well, first off, you need to know what the sum means. Sum means the addition. So we know we're adding these numbers together. So we're going to add three numbers together, and we know they're going to equal negative 147. So they need to be consecutive odd integers. So now let's think, how can we rewrite these as a variable? Because we don't know what they are, and we can represent the unknown as a variable. But the thing is, if you try to rewrite them as three separate variables, so x plus y plus z, well, however many unknowns you have is how many equations you need to create to solve. So since we only know one thing about them, that they add to negative 147, we need to create this as an equation only using one variable. So it doesn't matter which one of these consecutive odd integers you're choosing to represent as your first variable. I'm just going to say that I don't know the first number, so I'm just going to represent it by x. So if this is x, think about what we need to do to get to the next consecutive odd integer. How do I get from 1 to 3? Well, I can add 2 to it to get to that. So that means I can represent this second number by x plus 3. So x plus, I'm sorry, not x plus 3, x plus 2 plus x plus 2. All right, and the reason why is because we're talking about consecutive odd integers, we know that they're skipping a number every time. So 1, well, we skip 2, 3, we skip 4, 5, we skip 6, 7. So each integer is 2 more than the next. But 5, so remember, we have to then represent 5 using x, and x represented that number 1. So to get to 1 to 5, we are actually adding 4 because it's 2 integers away. So this is actually x plus 4. So then that third consecutive integer, we can represent as x plus 4. All right, because the first number, whatever it is, the second consecutive integer from that first one has to be 2, more than it. And then that next consecutive integer has to be 4 more than it for us to skip the correct number of numbers in between. So now we just solve. X plus x plus x is equal to 3x. 2 plus 4 is equal to 6. So now we're going to go ahead and we simplified as much as we could. So now we're going to isolate. So we're going to subtract that 6. So 3x is then equal to negative 153. And then we're going to divide each side by 3. So x is then equal to negative 51. But the question, though, doesn't just say what is that. It gives us what is true. So if we had negative 51 represented x as our first odd integer, then in order to get the next one, we would add 2 to it. So it would be negative 49. And then the last one, add another 2, so negative 47. So these are the three consecutive odd integers that add to negative 147. And that means that the largest odd integer for the question we had would be this b, is negative 47. All right, so for this one, I'm not going to create it as an equation. I'm just going to go through and logically solve it with you. Sometimes I might create an equation with it, sometimes I won't. Since they're not asking you to do an equation for this one, and this one wouldn't be considered exceeding, I'm just going to say how you can logically think through it. So William wanted to add fertilizer to his Lima bean garden. Each small bag of fertilizer can fertilize an area of 2 square feet. So each bag can do 2 square feet. If he planted 5 Lima bean plants on every square foot, so 5 plants on 1 square foot, how many Lima bean plants could he fertilize with 8 small bags? So we have 8 small bags. All right, so for this, we're just going to say, okay, 5 plants on every 1 square foot. But the bags are in 2 square feet. So that means I need to figure out how many plants I can do for 2 square feet. Well, if I'm going from 1 square foot to 2 square feet, I can do that by timesing by 2. So if I can do 5 plants for 1 square foot, well, I can times by 2 and say, okay, that means for every 2 square feet, I can do 10 plants. Well, he has 8 small bags, and each bag can do 2 square feet. So that means, okay, each bag is 2 square feet, and each bag can do 10 plants. So I can then times this by 8, because I have 8 bags, and that will then give me 80 Lima bean plants, which is then going to be choice D. All right, so this one we just logically thought it through. Well, 5 plants for every 1 square foot. The bags are talking about it in terms of 2 square feet. So that means I want to figure out how many plants I can do for each, for 2 square feet, because that's telling me how many plants I can do per bag. So that means 10 plants for every 2 square feet. There's 8 bags, so I can then do 80 Lima bean plants. All right, so for this one, same thing. We're not going to set it up as an equation. I wouldn't make you do this for an equation. This one we can just logically think through. So we're just seeing, can you kind of apply what we've been doing with these equations and word problems and kind of combine it together? Next year, you will have to be able to translate this into an equation and then solve. But for now, it's just, can you logically do it? And using kind of the steps we did for solving just regular straight up algebraic equations. So for this, it says a water container has a total capacity of 137.4 quarts. If the water container is leaking 1.2 quarts per minute, how many minutes will it take for the water container, which is filled to capacity, to only be 40% full? So we have this container, and this container is filled to capacity. And we're saying, how long will it take for it to get to 40%? So that means if we're getting to 40%, that means that 60% has drained. So I'm going to then say, well, if we have a total of 137.4 quarts, well, what is 60% of that? So if I times this by 60%, or we do 137.4 times 0.6, then that is equal to 82.44. So that means 82. So if I'm going to redraw this, so that means we're here now. We're at 40% filled. So that means 80% leaked out, which then means that 82.44 quarts has leaked out of this water container. So the problem I see that some of you might have had with this is that you saw 40%, times it by 40% and figured it out that way, but that's what's remaining. So then that means what left was 60%. So that means 82.44 quarts has leaked out, and we're leaking 1.2 quarts per minute. So then that means if we're trying to figure out how many minutes, we can then divide it by 1.2. And 82.44 divided by 1.2 is then 68.7. So that means it took 68.7 minutes for it to leak out, because it's saying we're leaking out 1.2 quarts per minute if you wanted to create this as an equation, we know it's 1.2 times the number of minutes that we have is then equal to 82.44 quarts that we have remaining. And that's how we know that we're dividing it by 1.2. All right, so for this, it will then be 68.7 minutes. All right, so for this one, it says an object is dropped from an altitude of 45,300 feet. During the first 5 minutes, the object drops 12% of its initial altitude of the 45,300 before deploying its parachute. After the parachute is deployed, the object drops at the rate of 680.4 feet per minute. What will the altitude of the object be 15 minutes after it was dropped? So that means after it was dropped is including this first 5 minutes. And then we're not doing 15 minutes after that. We're doing an additional 10. So we have this object that was dropped. It's free falling for 5 minutes. Then it deploys its parachute. So here's this, imagine it's a parachute. And then it drops for an additional 10 minutes because it's 15 in total. So what is the altitude of the object after it was dropped? So how high is it now? So the first thing we're going to do is figure out, well, how far did it drop initially when it was deployed without or set off without an parachute? And we know it's 45,300 feet, and it dropped 12% of its initial altitude. So you can either multiply it by 0.12 and then subtract that, or I can then do 0.88, because if we drop 12%, we can then subtract 45,300 minus 12% times that 45,300, or I know that there's 88% remaining, so I can just multiply it by that. So that means after this initial drop where there's no parachute, we are now at 39,864 feet, because that is 88% of that 45,300, or 12 times 45,300 is 5,436. And if we did 45,300 minus that, we get the exact same answer, 39,860. Now from here, it's not free falling anymore. It is now dropping at 680.4 feet per minute. And we know that we're falling now for 10 minutes. So I'm now going to do 680.4 times 10, which is then equal to 6,804 feet. So that means it dropped an additional 6,804 feet. So then if I did 39,864 minus what it now dropped with the parachute going, so 39,864 minus 6,804 is then going to give me 33,060 feet. So that's where it is now at. What will the altitude be? So not how far did it drop, but what is its altitude now? So if anyone got A, what you did wrong is you did 15 times this 680.4 and didn't take into consideration the first 5 minutes that you free fall. So our answer here is 33,060, which is then our choice C. All right, that is it. That's the only ones that you guys asked for me to go through. So if you have any questions, let me know.